So we'll get started on advanced Fiddler techniques. A little bit about myself. So I have my email, my Twitter, and my blog information. I am a progress ninja for Fiddler specifically. I've been working with Fiddler for more than a decade, and I've just picked up a lot of different tips and tricks and things I hadn't known when I needed every day. My full-time job, I'm a e-commerce developer. So I work on websites every day, have problems just like everyone else, and I use this to help troubleshoot. So I've just learned various things throughout the years of using it that I thought I would share. So again, if you have questions, put it in the chat or speak up and we'll take them as we go. So when we talk about Fiddler, we're going to talk about the hypertext transfer protocol. There's actually two different versions of this. So this is the protocol used between the web browsers and the servers to communicate with each other. So I give you the links to the actual RFCs, and you can read. I've read both of these. It turns out helpful when you're debugging and troubleshooting. If you're not sure how it's supposed to behave, it's sometimes useful to reference those. I wouldn't say every browser in the world obviously follows all of the rules exactly, but it is nice to know what's supposed to happen so they're readable. I put the HTTP2 in italics only because currently Fiddler does not support HTTP2. So I just wanted you to be aware that if you open Fiddler when you're trying to troubleshoot HTTP2, it will actually cause it to fall back to HTTP 1.1. So if you have to do specific HTTP2 stuff today, you'd have to go to a lower level tool like a Wireshark or something similar. HTTP is a request and a response paradigm, which we're going to see throughout the talk. So the client is making a request, the server sending the response, and both of those are made up of both a header and a body, which we'll see. So what is Fiddler? So Fiddler is a tracing tool that was built specifically for HTTP, and it was made by Eric Lawrence. So Eric was working at Microsoft, and he worked on the clip art team. So people would pay to download clip art, and then they would have some issues. They would try to reach his support team, and there's no good way to troubleshoot. So back then, Netmon was probably one of the more popular. It was a Microsoft tool similar to Wireshark. So it was very low level. It handled lots of different protocols, but it didn't bring it up to the level where it was easy to see a single request and response. You'd see basically all of the packets going back and forth, which just made it a little difficult to do tracing. So
why is Thanos code? I don't.
looks like I got muted accidentally there. Okay, so Eric did not know C#. He did not know HTTP, and he didn't know .NET. And he just decided to learn all of those things and write Fiddler, which I always find kind of amazing. It was acquired by Telerik in 2012, which is now owned by Progress. It's still a free tool. There's actually two versions of it now. So if you see the link, they call the version I'm going to show you today is called Fiddler Classic. So if you've used Fiddler, this is probably what you're very familiar with. I'm going to continue to show most of the demos today in Classic just because most of these are advanced things that have not made it into the newer version. So the newer version is called Fiddler Everywhere, and I'm going to talk about that at the very end. It's a cross-platform, runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux. And so if you needed to troubleshoot those platforms before, now you can finally get an implementation of Fiddler for that specific platform. I'll show you another way to do it throughout the talk here, but just be aware that's where you can find it. It is available for free. They do have a lot of good documentation. So if you come out to the website again, if I were to go here, that'll be Fiddler Everywhere. I can still get Fiddler Classic, but they have a lot of good documentation and support articles and blog entries about how you can use Fiddler effectively. So I recommend you check that out. So how does Fiddler work? Fiddler's what's called a proxy. So it's going to sit between the client and the server, watching the HTTP or HTTPS conversation. So what it does on Windows, it's going to adjust Windows proxy configuration so it can intercept traffic. So let's take a look at what that would look like. So I use New Edge from Microsoft. If you haven't used it, it's great. performs very well. I like the privacy settings. So I'm just going to go into System. I'm going to open my proxy settings, and you'll see that right now I'm running Fiddler. So it actually changed Windows configuration to say, please have anyone who wants to use a proxy, they should point to 127.0.0.1. If you've ever seen the t-shirt, there's no place like 127.0.0.1. That's home, right? That points to my own machine. So when I started up Fiddler, it basically told Windows if anyone uses a proxy, which all the modern browsers do, it should use these settings. So it's looking on this default port for Fiddler, and it's routing the HTTP. And if I go over a little, it's routing the HTTPS traffic as well. So now any of that traffic from the browsers will actually get routed through Fiddler, so I can see that traffic. So it's important to understand, by default, the modern browsers are going to do that for you, and you'll just get the tracing that you want. But be aware, if you're using certain clients, they may not proxy by default. So if you're using a tool that should be talking HTTP and yet you don't see any of the traffic in Fiddler, check to make sure that the proxy settings are set for that, because it's running as a separate app and you're trying to route the client traffic to that app. That's what the proxy settings will do for you. Terminology, this caught me a little off guard at first. Within Fiddler, Eric chose web session to be a single request and response. So I'm an ASP.NET developer, so when I think about a session, I think about all of the requests and response my browser made to my ASP.NET website over a period of time. But when you see the documentation, what we'll talk about here, a web session is just a single request and response. There's going to be a lot of things I can do with this. So I'm just going to open it up and show you some of the various things we'll do. So I've got Fiddler running here. I'm just going to open up, I have a fictional travel web page. Just going to hit Control F5 here to make sure that it is refreshed. And if I go in here, I can see the list of web sessions. And then if I right click, I can actually do quite a few things on that individual session. So if I wanted to, I could save off that response. So if I needed, say I was internal on a website, I found an image I needed, a logo, I can just take any individual session here and save off the actual file so I could reference it later. I can also do marking. So it's very common that I'll use Fiddler to help troubleshoot with other developers, with my ops team, with third parties. So we work with a lot of third parties. I may find something that's not working. So I might come in here and say, for instance, I want to right click. I'm going to mark this with orange just to make it obvious. And I'll put a comment on here. Please update to latest. Now, when I send this to someone else, they can immediately see what I've got highlighted. And if they want, they can read my comments on that particular one. So because I use it for conversations a lot, I'll do that kind of marking just so people are aware. One thing it took me a long time to find was this decode compressed content. So if you see, I made a request, pretty typical web page. Just got a carousel. I'm using Bootstrap. On a very large site, it's not uncommon that I might see something like this. I see this font being used, this halflings. I don't remember putting that in myself, right? On a really large site, like I said, we include third-party content. If I see something being requested, I might try to figure out who is doing that or why is that in here. So Fiddler does have a find sessions tool. So I'm going to type find sessions. I'm just going to type halflings and hit find sessions. So it did find the actual, so it matches on both the URL and I can tell it where to search, but it'll look in the URL and in the body. So this is a little odd. It found the font itself, but I expected something to reference that font and I still don't see it. So something to be aware of. I use compression. I hope that you do as well for performance. So with HTTP compression, the search by default is not actually decompressing before it does a search. So I want to make sure that I check this decode compress content. If I hit find sessions again, now you'll see it highlighted Bootstrap. So if I were to go into Bootstrap, I can see that the CSS I use from Bootstrap is using the halflings font. So that solves my problem. Another cool feature, if you have a request like that, you can actually just right click and say, I want to find the parent request. So if I select the parent request, it immediately tells me it's Bootstrap. So again, there'll be a lot of times where security related, performance related, something doesn't function right. I don't know why this file is there, who's causing an error. It's easy for me to search across all the sessions and find particular text, or actually trace back to parent requests so I can see why that was doing something that I didn't expect. Another cool feature, I can alt click on a cell. So I'm going to hold down the alt button here, and I'm going to say I want to see any other file that is a JPEG. So if I hold alt and I click the value of this column, you'll see that it highlighted all of the other JPEGs. So if you have a really long list, typical web pages are about 100 requests. It's not so easy to find all of the CSS or all of the JavaScript, whatever value I'm looking for. Maybe I'm looking for HTTP or HTTPS or certain status code. Just hold Alt and click on that particular value, and it will find all of the other ones that match. So that's kind of a cool feature as well. Next, we'll talk about decrypting HTTPS. So if your site doesn't completely use HTTPS, it should. There's two. HTTPS is really just everything you know about HTTP, but running over an encrypted channel. So years ago, it would use SSL. Today, you should be using TLS or transport level security. So what I want to do is, I've used my websites. I've been doing web development forever. We used to only use HTTPS, say, in once you're authenticated, for instance. Years ago, Fiddler could not decrypt that HTTPS. So as soon as I got into that section of the site, I could no longer troubleshoot. So this was a feature added quite a while ago. And it should kind of disturb you when I tell you that I can put a tool in between your browser and your server and decrypt your HTTPS, right? Isn't that the whole point of having HTTPS, that people can't do this? Well, it's true, and I'm going to show you how it gets around that. Fiddler is going to be a person in the middle. So again, Fiddler is a proxy. So it's sitting between my client and my server. So what I can do, let me pull up Fiddler here, and we'll just look what it does by default. So I'm just going to go out to Bing. This uses HTTPS. If I were to go in here, you can see all I see is tunnels. I can't actually see any of the stuff that was sent. So that's what we want from HTTPS, correct? However, if I were to go in and change the options, I can go into HTTPS. I can click on this decrypt. So I'll tell you, when you do this the first time, it will actually, so here we go. It says scary stuff ahead. It says, do I want to trust the Fiddler root certificate? So what Fiddler's doing, it's sitting between me and the server. So what it's going to do is it says, Fiddler will create its own root certificate. So if you know how HTTPS works, it's going to act like it's a certificate authority. So if I trust this, which I want to do, I'm only doing this on my own machine and I know why I'm doing it, I'm giving Fiddler permission to create new certificates for me. So I'm going to say yes. It's going to ask me a whole bunch of times, are you sure you want to do this? I said yes. So now if I were to go back, hit Control F5 again, and let me close, make sure that picks up the new change. And if all is working, now you can see what you'd expect. All of the requests now to Bing. It's not just the tunnel that I see that was encrypted. Now I can see all of the stuff. And if I go back in here again, the only reason it's doing this, and it's only doing it on my machine, is because I trusted it. So if I go into my certificates, you can see there's a Bing certificate. So what Fiddler did is it created a cert that looked like Bing.com. That way my browser's happy. Then when the traffic gets to Fiddler, Fiddler has this certificate so it can decrypt the traffic. Then it re-encrypts over the internet using Bing's real certificate. So everything is encrypted the whole way, but this allows Fiddler to get in between and do that decryption for you. So again, it's safe. You're only doing it on your own machine. It's not violating or cracking HTTPS in any way. It's intentional. Right? By trusting that root certificate, it's generating those certificates for me on the fly. So this is very helpful because I can decrypt now any of the HTTPS traffic coming from my browsers, again, to the servers. Next, we'll look at some quick filters. So filters are just a easy way to, let me open up my Fiddler instance again. I may want to do certain things. So I've got my filters tab open. Let's go back and pull up our travel website. So here we go. I'll make a request again. So there's a few things I can do with these filters. So if I wanted to, I could say I only want to see traffic to or from a certain host. So typical websites today, like I said, there's about 100 requests. There's a lot of hosts involved. Maybe I only want to focus on a certain host. I can just say show only the following hosts, and I can type it here. I can also limit the traffic. So if you've opened Fiddler before and you notice there's all sorts of background traffic from Outlook and other things, and it's just confusing the list here, you can actually go in and say, I only want to see traffic from a particular process. So I could come in here and find the specific one I'm running here with Fiddler or with MS Edge. I can pick that specific instance. That just limits the amount of traffic that I will see in here, which is handy. Another cool thing, so we've done filtering to show what sessions we want to see. We can actually modify things on the fly. So if we look here, you can see I made a request to the page. It was about 10K here. I'm going to say delete request header. So if you know how compression works, browsers send to the server and say, I accept encoding, gzip, deflate, Brotli, whatever. That's just the browser saying I'm capable of letting you do compression for me. If I delete the request header, as my browser sends to the server will no longer see that. It will think the client can't handle compression. So let's go hit Control F5 here. And we'll see that it's not using any compression on that particular file. You can see here I've got Bootstrap. Bootstrap was compressed previously. You can see that here, but here it's not. So it went from 27K compressed to about 122K not compressed. But the important thing is just filters gave me a quick way to actually modify the traffic going from the client to the server. We'll see more ways to do that going forward, but that's kind of cool. I can also hide various things if I don't want to see authentication demands or not modified. Another one that I use, I can say, let's block CSS files. So if you do a lot of performance work, people are starting to inline some of their critical CSS. So in other words, I may want to put just the most important part of my page into the actual HTML because it won't have to wait for a download of another file. So if I did that, I could come into filters and say I want to block CSS. If I hit Control F5, I would be able to look at this and say, well, I obviously did not inline enough, right? In this case, I didn't try to inline any. But if I did, I could use the tool to let me selectively block CSS files. So I knew that without those, what would the page look like? It's just easier than modifying the source all the time by letting the tool do that for me. So again, those are some of the quick filters. The last one I'll mention, if you do any GDPR work, you can actually flag responses that set cookies. So if I wanted to, I could say, please put in italics any of the sessions that set a cookie. So if I have to make sure I know everyone's setting cookies on my site, that would be a quick way for me to see all the different hosts that are setting cookies. Now we'll get to some of the more advanced features of Fiddler. So Fiddler has a composer. So this is actually how Fiddler got its name. It lets you fiddle with requests. You can create them manually, or you can just make a request and drag. So I'm going to show you the drag technique. So let me clear this out. I'm going to turn these filters off for now. So I'm going to make a request again. I can see this list of requests. Now I can go to my Composer tab. I can type anything I want here and make up a request, but I'm going to drag over the request for the home page. And now that I have it in here, I can modify it in any way that I want. So there's a lot of times where I'll do security testing or things that aren't easy to make the browser emulate, I can actually come in here and say, well, what if my browser didn't send that accept encoding header? So I'm just going to take that out, modify the rest of this however I want. I'll hit the execute. I'll see the request goes. And then if I were to go look in the inspectors, again, I'm not compressing this one in the first place. Let me do the bootstrap one. If I bring the bootstrap one over, I'll delete that request, that header. I'll do that execute, and you'll see here it was again 27, here it's 122. So again, this is really handy to be able to come in and make any modification I want within the tool. Again, I could do this by hand, but I just like to start with something. What's a practical thing I could use this for? Let's say I have a web page. I've got these convertibles tablets for sale. I notice that I've got this price here. I want one. I can hit checkout. If I go into Fiddler and I'm just looking at this, let's go look at how this is being sent. If I looked at the raw view of the request, you can see that I've got, let me open this up as well. Make that a little bit bigger. Let me try that one more time. Right here, you can see the cost is actually being sent up with the request. So I'm just going to be curious, what if I change that to just $1? What would actually happen? So I'm going to drag this over to Composer. And I see right here, I'm going to change that to $1. I'm going to hit execute. I'm going to go back and look at that result in the inspector. I'm going to look at the response. And it tells me you've placed an order. Ordered will be billed to you at a cost of $1 each. That's a problem, right? That's a good example of a lot of times web developers are doing client-side validation or techniques like that, and they're not being safe on the server. So this is a way to, it'd be hard to simulate this, but as I'm doing a trace, I can see that they're actually sending the cost as part of the request. And unfortunately, they're taking the price directly out of the request. So someone could easily hack, make changes to that, and I would have problems just because my server wasn't dealing with it correctly. So that's kind of helpful. Another cool thing I can do is breakpoints, and this lets me interrupt requests. So let me go back here. I'm going to pull up our travel site again. I'm going to go down. There's a quick exec area in the bottom left. It lets me type command line. So I'm going to type BPU. BPU just says I want to set a breakpoint in Fiddler on the way the request is going from the client to the server. So in this case, I said I want to break anytime you're requesting bootstrap.css. So I hit enter. I go back and I'll hit Control F5. You notice Fiddler is glowing now. If I come in here, I'm going to see a request that's stuck. So here's the request for that CSS. Again, I can come in now and make changes to any of this content. So I'm going to take out that accept encoding again and just say run to completion. So now I've sat between the client browser and the server, and things that are coming from the client, I have the opportunity to manually change before it actually gets submitted. So if you see by taking out that accept encoding again, now my content coming back is not compressed. So I'm going to type BPU and just turn that breakpoint off so we don't have to wait for it. I can also set up a breakpoint on the way back. So in this case, I'm typing BP after site.css. So that's another CSS file on that site. And I'll scroll down here so you can see this. If I hit Control F5, it hits a breakpoint. I can come in and see my CSS. I'll take the compression off, and I'm just going to change this color from this color to red. Say run to completion, and you can see the changes. So I've actually had to use this quite often troubleshooting. In one case, it turned out we used bundled CSS files. worked great. One day we added some more styles. It happens that all of the IE browsers have a limit of 4,096 unique styles per style sheet. So as I was troubleshooting, I just could not figure out what was wrong. I finally just did a binary search. I came in and set up breakpoints, and I was just taking parts of the CSS out, and it didn't take me long to notice it kept changing based on not what I took in and out, but based on the size. And that ended up stumbling across that undocumented feature that somebody had mentioned on the web. Once I saw that a certain size, it got ignored. So it's just helpful to troubleshoot, to be able to get in between client and server and make any modifications I want to on the fly. Let me turn that back off again so we don't have to wait for that. So I just type BP after to clear it. Another cool feature is autoresponder. Again, because Fiddler is a proxy, I can actually say the client makes a request. I can make Fiddler return the entire response if I want, or do a lot of other things and make changes. So there's some rules I can set up within this autoresponder. So let's take a look at what those would look like. So I'm going to hit Control F5. So all I need to do is go to autoresponder, and I'm going to drag a request over. So I'm going to drag the main request over. Oh, we'll do Bootstrap again. If I bring Bootstrap over here, I can then change. So anytime it sees that exact URL, I want to do a delay in this case. So I'm going to add, I do a lot of performance testing, and I want to see what's the experience going to be like for my customers if my CSS file took a long time to download. So I put all my CSS on a CDN. That should be faster. For some reason, I want to see if my CDN is slow, how's my page going to respond? So I enable these rules. I let unmatch pass through, which just means if it doesn't match this rule, just let it go to the server normally. And I'll hit Control F5 and we'll see what my clients see. Well, what they see is a spinning browser, right? And unfortunately, there's no CSS. It's completely blank. Well, this is helpful to know. It's not easy to simulate my CDN having a specific file that's slow, but it's easy to do that with autoresponder. So now again, I could look at, should I inline maybe just enough of this header CSS into my HTML, so, or maybe just even the background color, so at least customers will see that something is happening. So that would be something I could use autoresponder to do for me. I could also change this to be different files, different, so I've used this often for third-party testing. If I had a third-party library and it failed, I want to know if it impacts my page rendering. Is it a single point of failure? I can drag that request over and I can return, say, a 404 or a 500 or whatever I need to return just to see what that behavior would be. Next thing we'll see with autoresponder, you see I've got the title here of Sydney. If I actually take one of these requests, so if I take that request we just made, I can unlock it for editing. I can go into the inspectors, and I'm actually just going to add some content to it. So I'm just going to add RJB here. And then if I drag that over to autoresponder, now what I'm saying is if you ever see that request for that page, I actually want to serve it using the 15th frame, which is this one from Fiddler itself. So in this case, it never actually went to the server. You see, I got to take off my delay there, but it did see the new title. So I was able to get in between and intercept. So I've heard people that have really important demos, they'll actually save off all of the website locally. And there's ways to do that with Fiddler as well. Save it locally on disk and set up rules so that if things are failing and their server's not behaving right, they can actually come in and just open Fiddler, have the rules configured, and it'll actually serve right here from disk instead of from the server. So it's just a nice fallback, for instance, if something was going wrong. You can also trace devices. So Fiddler Classic only ran on Windows. I told you Fiddler Everywhere works on Mac and Linux as well. There still are a lot of times where we run a responsive design for our website. So our site has to work good on phones, tablets, desktops, any form factor. Well, I don't have a version of Fiddler that runs on my iPhone. So if I'm using an iPhone and I'm having problems, how could I troubleshoot that? So what I can actually do is I will run Fiddler on my Windows laptop, and then I will configure my client. So I talked about Fiddler's just a proxy. It's an app sitting on a certain port on a certain IP address. So I'll go run Fiddler on my Windows machine. I'll go to a command prompt and figure out the IP address of that Windows machine. And then I'll show you what I can configure on the client. So it turns out on an iPhone, this is not where you would expect it. It's not in your browser settings. If you go to your Wi-Fi settings and you scroll down, there's an HTTP proxy area. I'll set it to manual. Here's the IP address of my Windows machine that's running Fiddler. Here's the default port. And then I just went into Fiddler Tools Options under Connections, and I say allow remote computers to connect. Now, it's not just clients on my own machine. Now, when I run that, you can see I opened up this website on my phone on that IP address. And then if I did the Fiddler trace, we'll see that at the bottom here, if I go to the inspectors, you can see it's using an iPhone. So again, it's just a way to be able to troubleshoot. I've actually started using this for more than just devices. I had a senior vice president in marketing that something didn't work on our website. Really don't want to install Fiddler on her machine if I don't have to, just because you know how it works, right? 2 weeks from now, she can't print. It's going to be my fault, right? Because I installed something on her machine. So it's not uncommon if I go to a non-technical person's desk and I'm trying to troubleshoot a site, I will often just go change their proxy settings to point at my Windows machine rather than install the software on their own machine, if that makes sense. So just be aware there's lots of ways to trace those kinds of devices. There are some common issues you might run into that I just want to touch on here because I've done these myself. So let me open up Fiddler again. So the first one is I can limit it to a specific process. So at the very top here, I'll show this one first. When I'm done doing a trace in Fiddler, I often turn off capturing. So for instance, I ran the web page. As soon as I get the least amount to prove what's wrong, I'll turn off capturing there by clicking. It's not uncommon that I'll go do some more searching and I'm saying, why am I not seeing anything in Fiddler? So just remember, if you do turn things on and off, make sure it's off down here. Also, if you see this any process up at the very top here, I can actually open a browser. I can click that and drag a crosshairs onto my particular browser instance, similar to what I did in filters. Now it will only capture traffic from that browser instance. Eric mentioned that he got a lot of feedback that my tracing doesn't work anymore. And it turns out people had done that to a browser. They close that browser. They forget to come back and click this again to say any process. So they were watching a browser instance that's now gone. They open up another browser and wonder why they don't see their trace. So just be aware those things can happen. I'm a .NET programmer. I'm on my machine here the way I'm set up. I'm the client. I'm also running IIS and ASP.NET on the same laptop. Fiddler is sitting between the browser and the web server, but my web server also makes third-party calls to HTTP, HTTPS resources on the web. And if you open Fiddler, you're going to see the client to web server traffic, but you don't see the back-end calls. And that's because by default, .NET classes are not going through a proxy. So there's ways to set them individually, or if you go in your config file in .NET, you can actually set and say, I want all of the .NET framework classes to go through this proxy. Then all of my other calls from ASP.NET will also be trapped in Fiddler. So again, if you're not seeing things, it doesn't matter what your client is, just make sure the client has a proxy set to point it to run at Fiddler, because again, Fiddler's a proxy. It's not like Network Monitor or Wireshark where it's tapping into your Ethernet or Wi-Fi and it sees everything. It's only seeing traffic that was specific proxy to that particular app, if that makes sense. So now that we've seen a lot of manual ways, composer, autoresponder, breakpoints, There's also going to be times where I want to use code to intercept and modify traffic. So Fiddler script was built into Fiddler, and it just lets me write code to do certain things. And there's a few common functions: on before response, on before request. So I can trap this. It's called jscript.net. It looks like a mashup of JavaScript syntax and .NET classes. So let's look at what that looks like. So I can say customize rules. And I'm just going to do a quick search here for my comments. So here I'm in my on before request. And I can just say, if you see a session come in where the URL contains .jpeg, I want to make that session be the color yellow. So I'm just going to save that. Let's go re-request the travel site here again. And now you'll see in Fiddler, all of that is yellow. So I can not only change what things look like within Fiddler, I can also make modifications to content. So again, I could strip out the request headers. I've used this to do testing, again, of third-party sites where I had a specific set of hosts. They had a lot of requests, so I didn't want to delay them individually in autoresponder. So I just set up a rule that said if the session is to this host, then add a delay. So I could delay everything that went to their resources via script code rather than have to set that up in autoresponder. So just be aware that's there. We talked about quick actions as well. So I won't go into full detail here, but in that, if I go, let me pull up Bing again. I can do it with this. If I just decided I didn't want to see fiddler2.com, I wrote my own extension RH. So it's just remove host fiddler2.com. And you can see that it came out of the session list. So that's another thing I wrote custom Fiddler script code for, to intercept that quick action. And then I just wrote it to say, if it matches this host name, take it out of the session list. So that's just kind of helpful. There are a lot of Fiddler extensions. So there are a lot of third-party add-ons you can find here. You can write your own extensions as well. I'm just going to show you the two of them that I find helpful: a JavaScript formatter and image bloat. So let me take this off. So I do a lot of performance work on my site. I want to use minified files, which is helpful. So you can see I've got jQuery minified, Bootstrap is minified for JavaScript. Well, that's helpful. It's great for production, but if I had to go troubleshoot now, and I actually tried to pull it up here, I'm going to turn off that autoresponder rule here so we don't have to keep waiting for our Bootstrap. If I want to be able to do client-side troubleshooting, I can go in DevTools and I could individually do, they usually call it pretty print, where it unminifies that JavaScript. If I want to do it across the board, I installed this extension for make JavaScript pretty. Now, if I go rerun this again and hit F5, you'll see it told me these were minified, but Fiddler got in between as a proxy and did the unminification. So now whatever my client is, even if it doesn't know how to get unminified, now it's being intercepted by Fiddler. Fiddler does the unminification. So now I can just go into DevTools and step through it without having to deal with minified files. Because if you've seen minified files before, it's one big long, right? And it's hard to troubleshoot and step through. So that's just kind of a cool feature. Another one I like is called Show Image Bloat. So if you take pictures with your phone and such and cameras, they put in metadata that talks about the shutter speed and all that kind of stuff. That's handy if you ever want to look at it, but on the web, who cares, right? My clients, it doesn't affect the visual quality, but when I turn on image bloat, you can see 43% of my little image here is metadata. So if I were to go back here and look at the desktop images, we'll look at the London. If I go into details, so I took this on a Canon PowerShot G9. It's got the date, time. Again, my people looking at my site don't care about this. I happen to use a tool called JPEG Tran that lets me remove all of that metadata. But you can see this image bloat lets me go back and quickly see on my site which images did I not remember to take metadata out of. So that's a very handy extension. So let me turn that one off. I'll briefly talk about Fiddler Cap. So I talked about if you have non-technical people that you need to perform captures for you, this is a tool that they can download. So let me close Fiddler. And what's nice about it is it's meant for non-technical people. So I'll often have to contact someone and say, make sure you clear your cookies, make sure you clear your cache, make sure that you could decrypt. I mean, all of this stuff is various levels of difficulty for non-technical people, but it's very easy for them to say, okay, I want to decrypt. It'll walk them through that. They can clear their cookies, clear their cache. They just hit start capture. That will open up a browser for them. And then they can do everything that's causing it to fail. They can even take a snapshot of the screen when it's broken. Very much appreciated. They hit stop, save. It'll save all of the requests. They can then send me that file. I can open it up, and in Fiddler, it'll look exactly like Fiddler did the trace, but it's just a lot easier for a non-technical person to do the capture for me. Some other miscellaneous things you can get from Fiddler. I talked about you can save response files, so that's helpful. I'm going to show you the screenshot feature. Let me hit, well, we'll do this, right? Maybe I want to send this in a screenshot. I'm going to have Fiddler open. If I want to now, I know this never happens to you, but people say, hey, your website didn't work, and they, okay, do a trace for me. If they hit this screenshot, and they toggle back to the web page. It takes 5 seconds. It'll then take a picture. Then if I go back, that picture gets embedded into the actual trace. So when they send me the Fiddler file, I can actually see what's on the screen. Very helpful if you troubleshoot. You know, the advice that the page didn't look right isn't really all that helpful. But having a screenshot embedded right with the rest of the trace is something very helpful to troubleshoot with. Another thing you can do, you can encrypt these files. So let me go, I'm going to do a Control F5 here. Let's say I need to send all of this in email to a third party. I can actually do the file save all sessions. One of the things that's not terribly obvious is I can send it encrypted. So if I pick password protected, and I'm just going to give it a name, A for now. It's going to ask me for a password. So this is actually good encryption. It's using 128-bit AES. You can configure it to use 256-bit AES. I just give it a password, right? Something better than that, obviously. It uses password key derivation. It will create an AES key for me and use AES encryption. So now when I save this, I will send that encrypted file. I can send that on over email on the internet, knowing that someone's not going to break that. Obviously not in the same email. I need to communicate to who's receiving it. Here's the password you're going to need. When they open up that archive, it will just say, tell me the password. It'll decrypt it. Everything will work as expected. So it's just nice that they have serious encryption built directly into the tool. Another feature a lot of people don't know about is the text wizard. There's a lot of times where I'll get content and I need to convert it. So you can see it'll be something base 64 encoded, URL encoded. I can just paste things here and do the transformation down here. So I could even do, if I want to type hello and see what's the SHA-256 hash look like, that's what it looks like in hex. So it's just very handy if you have to do a lot of web translations between different formats to be able to come in and do it via that text wizard. You can write custom inspectors. So as I click on any one of these, there are built-in inspectors, right? So they have a web view. That's without the CSS, obviously. There's image views if it's an image. If you have a custom format for a particular type, like somebody actually wanted to be able to decode binary WCF traffic, somebody wrote a custom inspector so that it just shows up as a new tab so that you can do that if you have specific content that you want to be able to show. Fiddler Core, at one point, they actually took all of the, call it plumbing code in Fiddler, pulled it out to Fiddler Core. So all of the capturing, replaying, that kind of logic was available as a separate product. So you could actually get Fiddler Core and you could embed that within your own application. So you'd get all, think of it as a headless Fiddler running inside your app. So if you're writing testing apps and stuff, that might be a cool option for you. You can spoof user agents. So I do this occasionally where I will want to look like I'm a different, so you can see it's been a while since some of these have been updated. We got Netscape 3 still, but I can act like I'm Edge. All that's doing then is every time I send a request to the server, instead of telling it I was using Chrome or whatever tool I was using, it'll look like it's Edge. It's not going to render anything different in your client, but in case your server were to return different content based on user agent strings, you can pick one or you can actually send a custom string. So that's kind of a nice override. I talked about the quick exec area. So let's go back in here. Down here, there's, if you're a command line sort of person, there's a bunch of built-in stuff. So if I type greater than 50,000, it's gonna, anything that's over 50K here will get highlighted. I can say I want to see less than 1,000. It'll show me the really small responses. I can also do select CSS, and it picks up all the CSS files. I use this one often, CLS, just clears out all the sessions. And again, you saw I actually had the remove host. I needed that a lot, where I just said, I don't want to see anything from this particular host. That's where I extended it myself in Fiddler script, so I could do just RH and the host name. So again, that's handy if you like command line things. Another cool feature is host remapping. So it's not uncommon. So we use third-party libraries on our site. Some of those libraries care about what domain name we're on. So for instance, I have my production www name, but I also have my development machine where I'm working. Some of these libraries won't function right if they're not on my official domain. So I'm going to show you how you can spoof it to look like you're on a different domain. So here we've got www.example.com. I can actually go into hosts and I'm going to set up a remapping. So here I'm saying if you ever see example.com, actually serve the site from my local host port 86. So now if I go back and hit Control F5, the URL still thinks it's example.com, but I'm actually running here. So again, I use this to act like I'm production. So maybe on my machine, I'm really, dev.example.com. But if I did that, a lot of my third-party libraries might say, ooh, we don't run here. We only run on www.example.com. So this is a way to spoof it out, to think in the browser that you are a different URL or host than you actually are. So again, I've used that for those kinds of purposes. So let's talk about Fiddler Everywhere quick. So again, we've been talking about Fiddler Classic. So now we're going to talk about Fiddler Everywhere. So the team at Progress has been doing a lot of work on getting Fiddler Everywhere and the advantages. So right now it's version 1.1. So I would say the primary advantages right today with this version is it's multi-platform. So if you want to run on something other than Windows, Fiddler Everywhere will run on Linux and a Mac. It has an improved user interface. So they've spent a lot of time on use cases and are trying to streamline it. You've seen Fiddler Classic. It has a lot of functionality, but sometimes it's hard to see where you're supposed to do certain tasks. So they're working on a new modern UI. They have a lot of collaboration tools built in. So I talked about saving a session archive and emailing it to someone. Fiddler Everywhere has features built in. So when you run Fiddler Everywhere, you'll sign in, and then you can actually share sessions in the cloud and then just email people and say, hey, the session's out here, here's the link. So those are the advantages. Right now, they're slowly adding features. So they've been growing, adding more and more as they go. Right now, these are the features that are missing. So this is why I showed that in Classic today, most of the advanced things. So I would say the average person who uses Fiddler 1.1 probably already does everything you want. It does tracing, it decrypts your HTTPS, it has Composer, it has auto responder. If you're using some of the more esoteric things that I showed today or the more advanced, you'll need to stay in Fiddler Classic for now. So these are some of the things that are missing. Again, they're shooting for feature parity. So they want to get Fiddler Everywhere to do everything Classic does. But let's take a look at what Fiddler Everywhere looks like. So again, I downloaded it. Let's just start it up. It will behave similar to Fiddler Classic. It's going to sign me in, so it knows who I am. I can store off past sessions that I wanted to keep, specific requests if I do a lot of API testing or make other requests that I want to be able to re-execute. It runs on a different port, but it also tells browsers to pick it up. So let's go, we'll go back to our travel site here. I'm gonna hit Control F5. It's going to look very similar to what you've seen. Here's the sessions again. If I were to right click, you can do a lot of the basically the same things you could do before. Mark things, you can add comments, you can select parent requests. So that's all very familiar. If I go on the right, I can see the raw request and responses. So that's handy. Again, I can turn it on. If I go into settings, I can make sure that I'm capturing HTTPS traffic. That's easy to do as well. And it's easy to shut it on and off. So this is a little more obvious than that click in the lower left corner. I can see that I'm capturing some traffic. I did save off a session before. So if I want to open that, you'll see that this is something that didn't work well in past Fiddler. You couldn't really have two instances open with previous and new. This is now just, here's my previously recorded and here's my current capturing. So it's easier for me to come in here and compare these things than it was before. I can also go to Composer. So I can just right click and say, edit this request in Composer. And you'll see this is similar to what we saw before. Here's the request headers. I can just take off that accept encoding again and tell it to go up and execute. So that's a handy way to get at Composer. I can do it raw as well, right? If I wanted to come on here and just take off certain things. So Composer works really well. I can also go add specific rules. So if I go to Bootstrap, I can say, please add a new rule. It's going to put it in auto responder. And then I can come in here again and say I want to delay it. So you'll see a lot of the major things most people use are already in here. And it continues to advance. And again, the cool part's it's cross-platform. It's got a cleaner UI than Fiddler Classic. And it's available in a lot more places. So that's handy as well. So that's Fiddler Everywhere. Keep an eye on it. Like I said, they're slowly adding features to this as they go. Some quick resources. So I'm a Pluralsight author. I actually have 2 courses on Fiddler. The more recent one takes the tact of you have a specific problem on your website. Should you use Fiddler? Should you use Chrome DevTools? What's the appropriate one? Can you use them both? So it walks through problems with CSS styles. How would you troubleshoot a style problem? What's the right tool? Performance issues. So you can check that out. I also have one that goes into a lot more detail than we had time for today as far as how do you write extensions in C#. You saw some of the Fiddler script stuff that I showed, some of the custom inspectors. So those are covered in the more advanced course here. Eric has also written a book called Debugging with Fiddler. So it's a very good book. I gave you a link, just happens to be on Amazon. You can get it wherever you want. I've probably read it 10 different times. So about every, 3 to 6 months, I'll pick it up. It's Fiddler Classic. I'll go read some things again. And every time I do, I find some new features or things that I've run into in the last 6 months that I didn't think Fiddler could do for me, that I suddenly realized, oh, I could do like the host remapping. I knew it was there. I didn't really piece together why I would want it. I had the problem where I had to act like production. I happened to be reading the book again and noticed, oh, that's what remapping does. I could simulate that. So it's a very good book if you're interested in getting that. Again, that's my Twitter, that's my email, and my blog information. Here's a link to the slides and the code. So there's not a lot of code there. There's just the fictional travel site, but you have access to all of the slides if you're interested in that.